The grand exhibition hall of the Quorath homeworld stretched for miles beneath crystalline domes that filtered the light of 3 suns. Delegates from hundreds of species moved between displays of cutting-edge metallurgy, each booth showcasing the pinnacle of galactic forging technology. Energy matrices hummed softly as they maintained molecular bonds and alloys that defied conventional physics. Quantum forges demonstrated real-time atomic manipulation. The air itself seemed to vibrate with technological superiority. Chen stood quietly beside her modest wooden table, feeling distinctly out of place. Her display contained no glowing screens or floating holograms. Instead, a simple cloth covered several objects, and a small portable forge sat cold and dormant in the corner. She wore practical work clothes, her hair tied back, her hands bearing the calluses and small scars of decades at the anvil. Other delegates had already walked past her booth with barely a glance, drawn instead to the spectacular light shows and demonstrations nearby. The Quorath themselves were an impressive species. Tall and graceful, with skin that shimmered like polished copper, they moved through the hall with the confidence of a civilization that had mastered metallurgy for over 50,000 years. Their forge masters were legendary across the galaxy. To be invited to their exhibition was considered the highest honor in the field. Sarah watched as a group approached her booth. At their center walked Tor'van, the most respected forge master in Quorath history. His ceremonial robes bore the symbols of every metallurgical achievement his people had accomplished. Other forge masters followed him at a respectful distance, along with curious apprentices and several recording drones that captured everything for the galactic archives. Tor'van's eyes, a deep amber color, swept across Sarah's simple display with what appeared to be mild amusement. He gestured toward the covered objects with one long-fingered hand. "The human contribution," he said, his voice carrying easily despite its soft tone. "We were curious what your young species might bring to a gathering of master metallurgists." Sarah smiled politely and pulled back the cloth, revealing 3 items. A chef's knife with an 8-inch blade. A small dagger with an ornate handle. And a sword, its blade catching the light in ways that made several Quorath lean forward involuntarily. The patterns on the steel were mesmerizing. Waves and swirls flowed along each blade like frozen water, darker and lighter bands creating designs that seemed almost alive. No 2 sections were identical, yet somehow the whole possessed a unified beauty that drew the eye and held it. Tor'van picked up the sword carefully, his expression shifting from amusement to puzzlement. He turned it slowly, watching how the light played across the surface. One of his assistants immediately produced a handheld scanner and began running it along the blade's length. "Decorative etching?" Tor'van asked, though his tone suggested he already knew that wasn't the answer. "No etching," Sarah replied. "That pattern goes through the entire blade. It's the structure of the steel itself." The assistant with the scanner made a sound of confusion. She held the device closer, adjusted its settings, then held it closer still. "Master Tor'van, the readings are unusual. The molecular structure shows distinct layering, but the pattern density is... I'm counting thousands of individual layers." Tor'van took the scanner and examined it himself. His amber eyes narrowed. He passed the sword to another forge master, who produced a different type of scanning device. This one projected a holographic cross-section of the blade's atomic structure into the air above it. The gathered Quorath went silent. The hologram showed layer upon layer of steel, each microscopically thin, folded and compressed together. The pattern created by these layers formed the visible waves on the surface, but it went far deeper. The structure was complex beyond anything their instruments had predicted. "This is impossible," Tor'van said flatly. "These molecular bonds should not exist in this configuration. The carbon distribution alone defies standard metallurgical principles. Different sections show contradictory crystalline structures that should fracture under any stress." He held the sword at arm's length as if seeing it for the first time. "What technology created this? Which quantum forge? What atomic manipulation matrix?" Sarah shook her head. "No quantum forge. No atomic manipulation. Just a traditional charcoal fire, a hammer, and an anvil." Several of the Quorath made sounds that their translation devices rendered as skeptical laughter. Tor'van's expression remained serious, however. He tested the blade's edge carefully against a standard testing material, watched it slice through with minimal resistance, then examined the edge again with his scanner. "The edge hardness rivals our best quantum-forged combat alloys," he said slowly. "Yet the spine shows flexibility that should be impossible in steel this hard. Your people have discovered some new molecular bonding technique and disguised it as primitive craftsmanship." "No disguise," Sarah said calmly. "We call this Damascus steel. The technique is over 1,000 years old on Earth. My family has been making blades like this for 15 generations." Tor'van studied her face, searching for deception. Finding none seemed to disturb him more than if he had caught her in a lie. He looked again at the blade, at the swirling patterns that his civilization's best instruments could analyze but not explain. "You claim this was made by hand," he said. "By heating metal in a primitive fire and striking it with a primitive hammer." "Yes. And you claim you can replicate this process." "I can. Here? Now. Before witnesses." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "Give me 3 days, raw materials, and space to work. I'll forge a blade from scratch using only traditional methods. You can watch every step." Tor'van was quiet for a long moment. Around him, the other forge masters whispered among themselves. This was unprecedented. If the human was lying, she would be exposed and humiliated before the entire galactic metallurgical community. If she was telling the truth, it would mean a primitive technique was achieving results their advanced civilization could not replicate. "Very well," Tor'van said finally. He handed the sword back to Sarah with careful reverence. "Tomorrow morning we will provide you with a forge space and whatever raw materials you require. I and my fellow masters will observe your process. If you succeed in creating such a blade through primitive means, the Quorath will acknowledge that perhaps we have something to learn from human methods." His tone made it clear he expected no such acknowledgement would be necessary. He believed she would fail or reveal hidden technology, or find some excuse to withdraw from the challenge. Sarah simply nodded and began covering her display again. "Tomorrow morning then. I'll need iron or not processed steel. And high-carbon charcoal. Natural materials only." As Tor'van and his entourage moved on to the next exhibit, Sarah allowed herself a small smile. She had seen that look before, on the faces of metallurgists and engineers throughout human space. The look that said her craft was outdated, that modern technology had made traditional skills obsolete. They always looked different after watching her work. Tomorrow the Quorath would understand what her ancestors had known for centuries. Sometimes the old ways weren't inferior. Sometimes they held secrets that all the quantum forges in the galaxy couldn't replicate. She pulled the cloth fully over her blades and began preparing mentally for the demonstration ahead. 3 days to prove that human hands and human patience could achieve what an entire advanced civilization had declared impossible. 3 days to show them Damascus steel. The demonstration space the Quorath provided was a sterile white room with perfect temperature control and air filtration systems. Viewing platforms surrounded the central work area, already filling with curious forge masters and their apprentices. Recording drones hovered at precise intervals, their lenses focused on the empty space where Sarah would work. Sarah surveyed the room and immediately shook her head. "I need to work outside. Natural air flow is essential." Tor'van, watching from the primary observation platform, gestured to one of his assistants. "Humidity and temperature fluctuations will compromise the process. This controlled environment is far superior." "For your methods maybe," Sarah replied. "Not for mine. I need open air, natural wind, and room to build a proper forge." The Quorath conferred among themselves in their musical language. Finally they agreed to relocate to an outdoor courtyard. Within an hour, Sarah stood in a wide stone plaza beneath the 3 suns, with viewing stands erected hastily around the perimeter. Hundreds of Quorath filled the seats, their copper-toned skin gleaming in the bright light. Several assistants brought the materials Sarah had requested. Unprocessed iron or in rough chunks. Bags of charcoal. Clay from a nearby riverbed. Limestone. Sand. They set everything on the bare stone and stepped back, clearly uncertain what she intended to do with such crude materials. Sarah knelt beside the pile of fire bricks they had provided and began examining them. Too uniform, too perfectly manufactured. She set them aside and turned instead to the loose stones scattered around the courtyard's edge. She began selecting specific ones, testing their weight and structure, setting some aside and discarding others. "What is she doing?" one of the younger Quorath asked loudly enough for the translation devices to pick up. "Those are decorative landscaping stones." "Building a forge," Sarah answered without looking up. She had found a dozen suitable stones and was now arranging them in a circular pattern on the ground. "Fire needs proper airflow. These stones have the right density and heat resistance." She worked steadily, mixing clay with sand and water to create mortar, then carefully stacking stones to form a bowl-shaped depression. The Quorath watched in silence as she constructed what looked to them like a primitive campfire pit. When someone offered her a molecular bonding adhesive, She politely declined and continued using her clay mixture. Colrim, a young Quorath apprentice with darker copper skin than most of his fellows, leaned forward from his seat in the viewing stands. He was considered exceptionally talented, already working on advanced projects that would have been beyond most forge masters in other species. Yet something about the human's methodical, unhurried movements fascinated him. Sarah spent the entire first morning just building her forge. She created a simple bellows from leather and wood, testing it repeatedly until the airflow satisfied her. She arranged the charcoal carefully, explaining to the increasingly skeptical audience that the quality and placement of each piece mattered. When she finally lit the fire, she did so with a traditional flint striker, refusing the plasma igniter someone offered. "This is absurd," muttered one of the senior forge masters. "She's wasted half a day building equipment we could have provided in minutes." Tor'van said nothing, but his eyes never left Sarah's work. There was something deliberate in her every action, a precision that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with practice skill. By afternoon, Sarah had her forge burning steadily. She began processing the raw iron ore, heating it in the charcoal fire until impurities bubbled out. The Quorath's instruments detected the chemical changes, displaying them on floating holographic screens for the audience. But Sarah worked by color and sound, judging the metal's readiness by the exact shade of orange-red in the flames and the subtle changes in how the fire crackled. "Her temperature variance is 0.3%, Colrim noted, reading from a datapad. "Our quantum forges maintain 0.001% variance. This is incredibly imprecise." The forge master beside him nodded in agreement. "Exactly. Inconsistent heat means inconsistent molecular structure. The final product will be flawed." But Colrim continued watching, his analytical mind tracking patterns. The temperature did vary, but not randomly. When Sarah pumped the bellows, the heat spiked in specific ways. When she repositioned the metal in the coals, it cooled at rates that seemed connected to what she was trying to achieve. The variations weren't errors. They were intentional. Sarah pulled the processed iron from the forge with long tongs. It glowed bright yellow, almost white at the edges. She carried it to a simple stone anvil she had positioned nearby and began hammering it with powerful rhythmic strikes. Each blow sent sparks flying. Each impact shaped the glowing metal, flattening and spreading it. The sound of hammer on anvil rang across the courtyard. It was a sound the Quorath had not heard in millennia. Their ancestors had worked metal this way once, tens of thousands of years ago, before they developed energy forging and molecular manipulation. The primitive clang of it stirred something in their ancestral memory. Sarah worked the iron into a flat bar, heating and hammering, heating and hammering. Sweat ran down her face despite the temperature-controlled bodysuit she wore. Her movements were powerful but controlled, each strike placed with absolute precision. The metal sang under her hammer, its tone changing as its structure transformed. "She's creating stress patterns in the molecular bonds," observed another forge master, studying his instruments. "Those will become fracture points when the metal cools." But Sarah seemed unconcerned. She returned the flattened bar to the forge, buried it in charcoal and began adding her carbon source. Crushed bone and organic materials that would release carbon into the iron as it heated. The Quorath wrinkled their noses at the smell, but Sarah breathed it in like perfume, using the scent to judge how the process was progressing. Colrim's instruments showed the carbon diffusing into the iron's crystalline structure. But again the distribution was uneven. Some areas absorbed more carbon than others. By every standard of modern metallurgy this was failure. Yet Sarah nodded in satisfaction and pulled the metal out for more hammering. "Watch the edges," Colrim whispered to himself, zooming his scanner in on the glowing metal. As Sarah's hammer struck, tiny fractures appeared and immediately welded shut under the heat and pressure. The stress patterns the other forge master had worried about were being incorporated into the metal's structure, creating pathways that redistributed force in unexpected ways. Sarah folded the bar in half, hammered it flat, then returned it to the forge. She repeated the process again and again. Each time the layers doubled. Each time the carbon redistributed slightly differently. Each time the metal's internal structure grew more complex. 2 layers become 4. 4 become 8. 8 becomes 16, Tor'van said quietly, understanding dawning in his voice. "She's creating the layered structure manually." "But the inconsistency," another master protested. "Every fold introduces new variables. The final product will be chaotic." "Perhaps," Tor'van replied. "Or perhaps chaos is the point." Colrim ran a new analysis, this time looking not at individual molecular bonds but at the overall pattern emerging across multiple folds. His eyes widened. The variations weren't creating weakness. They were creating something his instruments had never seen before. Each microscopic region of the steel was developing slightly different properties, yet they worked together as a unified whole. Hard regions next to flexible regions. Tension balanced against compression. As the second sun set and artificial lights illuminated the courtyard, Sarah continued her methodical work. Fold, hammer, heat. Fold, hammer, heat. The Quorath audience, initially skeptical, grew quieter. Even those who still doubted found themselves mesmerized by the rhythm of the work, by the sparks flying with each hammer blow, by the transformation of crude ore into something approaching beauty. Dawn on the second day found Sarah already at work, her forge glowing in the early morning light. She had slept only a few hours, but her movements showed no fatigue. The steel had been folded 16 times during the previous day. Now it would be folded 16 more. The viewing stands filled early. Word had spread across the Quorath homeworld about the human demonstrating ancient forging techniques. Scientists from other disciplines arrived alongside the metallurgists. Philosophers came to observe what they called performance archaeology. Even artists attended, claiming the rhythmic hammering had an aesthetic quality their culture had forgotten. Tor'van stood at his usual position on the primary observation platform, his instruments arrayed before him. Beside him, 3 other senior forge masters monitored their own scanning equipment. Holographic displays showed the steel's internal structure in exquisite detail, updated in real time as Sarah worked. She pulled the steel from the forge with her tongs, its surface glowing the color of a setting sun. The bar was now perhaps 10 inches long, 2 inches wide and half an inch thick. It looked unremarkable to the untrained eye, but the scanners told a different story. Current layer count is 65,536, announced one of the monitoring technicians. Carbon distribution remains non-uniform across all layers. Crystalline structure shows 17 distinct grain patterns coexisting in the same piece. Sarah placed the glowing steel on her anvil and raised her hammer. The first strike landed with a clear, ringing tone. Sparks fountained into the air. The steel flattened slightly under the blow. She rotated it 90 degrees and struck again. And again. Each impact precise, each one placed exactly where she intended. Impossible, Tor'van muttered, watching his displays. The force distribution from those hammer strikes should create fracture cascades. The steel should be developing internal cracks. But the scanners showed no cracks. Instead, they showed something far stranger. Each hammer blow created compression waves that traveled through all 65,000 layers simultaneously. Where these waves intersected existing stress patterns, they didn't create failure points. They created new bonding structures. Quorath watched from his seat in the lower stands, his young mind racing to understand what he was witnessing. He had brought 3 different types of scanners today, plus his personal research tablet loaded with every metallurgical reference in the Quorath archives. None of them explained what was happening. Sarah returned the steel to the forge, burying it deep in the white-hot charcoal. She pumped the bellows with steady rhythm, bringing the temperature up gradually. The monitoring equipment showed the heat climbing, but again the distribution was uneven. The center of the steel bar reached a different temperature than the edges. 0.7% variance now, a technician called out. Temperature gradient is actually increasing. Stop the demonstration, one of the senior forge masters demanded suddenly. This human is either deceiving us with hidden technology or destroying the metal through incompetence. Either way, we're wasting time. Tor'van held up one hand for silence. Look at the bonding patterns. Truly look at them. The forge master who had complained turned to his holographic display with obvious reluctance. Then his expression changed. The uneven heating was causing different layers to expand at different rates. This should have caused delamination, the layers separating from each other. Instead, the expansion differences were creating new interlocking structures. Layers compressed against each other in some areas while allowing microgaps in others. The overall effect was like thousands of tiny springs wound through the metal. Sarah pulled the steel out again and folded it. 32 folds now. Over 130,000 layers. She hammered it flat with the same steady rhythm, the same practiced precision. Her face showed deep concentration but no stress. This was meditation for her, a practice refined through thousands of hours at the forge. She's not counting, Quorath said suddenly. Several nearby Quorath turned to look at him. She's not measuring or calculating. She's feeling it. One of his instructors made a dismissive gesture. Feeling is not methodology. Precision requires measurement. But what if the measurement is happening through experience rather than instruments? Colrim stood up, moving closer to the railing for a better view. Watch her eyes. She judges the temperature by color. She judges the metal's readiness by sound. She judges the carbon content by smell. Her entire body is the measuring instrument. Sarah repeated the folding process. 33 folds. 34. 35. The number of layers climbed exponentially. 262,000. 524,000. Over 1,000,000 individual layers compressed into a bar of steel the size of a large knife blade. The holographic displays became almost impossible to interpret. There were too many layers, too many grain boundaries, too many intersecting stress patterns. The computers rendering the images began simplifying their output just to show something comprehensible. This violates fundamental material science principles, Tor'van said, but his voice carried wonder rather than dismissal. Different regions of this steel have different crystalline structures. Some areas show body-centered cubic grains. Others show face-centered cubic. They shouldn't coexist. They should create boundary failures. He zoomed his display in on one particular region where 3 different grain structures met. Here. This intersection should be the weakest point in the entire piece. The stress concentration should be enormous. But further analysis showed the opposite. That intersection point was distributing stress across all 3 grain types, each one handling different types of force. Compression, tension, and shear were being balanced against each other at the microscopic level. It's adaptive, Colrim breathed. The structure is adapting to different types of stress. Sarah worked through the afternoon, the 3 suns tracking across the sky above her. Sweat soaked through her clothes despite the cooling systems in her bodysuit. Her hammer arm must have been aching, but her strikes remained consistent. Fold, heat, hammer. Fold, heat, hammer. A meditation. A dance. A conversation between maker and metal. 40 folds. 41. 42. The steel was transforming into something that existed nowhere else in the known galaxy. Every quantum forge in Quorath space produced uniform molecular structures. Perfect crystalline alignment. Identical properties throughout every cubic millimeter. They had believed this uniformity was the ultimate achievement. Sarah Steele mocked that assumption. It was deliberately, magnificently non-uniform. Hard where it needed to be hard. Flexible where it needed to flex. Tough where it needed to resist fracture. All within the same piece, all working together. As the second sun began setting, Sarah finally stopped folding. She shaped the steel carefully, drawing it out into the rough form of a blade. The hammer strikes changed now, becoming more precise, more targeted. She was no longer working the entire piece but refining specific areas. Edge geometry forming, a technician reported. She's creating differential thickness without changing the folding pattern. The blade emerged under her hammer. Straight-backed, single-edged, about 12 inches long. Not fancy, not decorative, but purposeful. A working knife that would cut for generations. Tor'van stared at his instruments in silence. The steel Sarah had created contained contradictions that should not exist. Regions hard enough to cut their best alloys existed millimeters away from regions flexible enough to bend without breaking. High carbon content in some layers, low carbon in others, yet no delamination. Grain structures that competed in laboratory samples cooperated here. Tomorrow, he said quietly, we will see if it survives the quench. That is when contradictory structures typically fail. But Colrim was already certain of the outcome. He had watched something profound over these 2 days. The human hadn't fought against the metal's nature. She had worked with it, guided it, allowed it to become what it needed to be. That wasn't primitive technique. That was mastery his civilization had forgotten existed. The third morning arrived with an unusual tension in the air. The viewing stands were packed, every seat filled with Quorath eager to witness either triumph or failure. Scientists had abandoned their laboratories. Artisans had closed their workshops. Even government officials attended, curious about the primitive human technique that had captivated their civilization's greatest minds. Sarah stood before her forge, examining the blade she had shaped the previous day. It was rough still, its surface covered in scale and oxidation from repeated heating. But its form was there, waiting to emerge. She set it carefully on her work table and turned her attention to a bowl of clay mixture she had prepared overnight. Today we see if everything comes together, she announced to the assembled crowd. This is the hardening process. The quench. This is where most blades either succeed or fail. Tor'van leaned forward in his seat. His instruments were calibrated to their highest sensitivity. Every other forge master had similar equipment trained on Sarah's workspace. Failure would be obvious instantly. Success, if it occurred, would be undeniable. Sarah began coating the blade with clay. She worked slowly, deliberately, applying thick layers to the spine and thinner layers toward the edge. The coating was uneven, rough, almost careless in appearance. Several Quorath made sounds of confusion. "The clay application lacks precision," observed one of the senior forge masters. "Different thicknesses will cause uneven cooling rates during the quench." "That's the point," Colrim said quietly from his seat. He had spent the night studying ancient metallurgy texts from a dozen civilizations, searching for references to similar techniques. The edge needs to be hard. The spine needs to be flexible. Different cooling rates create different crystalline structures. "Impossible," another forge master scoffed. "You cannot have contradictory heat treatments in one piece. The boundary between them will fail immediately." Sarah finished coating the blade and set it aside to let the clay dry. While she waited, she prepared her quenching medium. Not water as many expected, but oil. She poured it into a long metal trough, checking its temperature with her hand. When someone offered a digital thermometer, she declined with a smile. "The oil needs to be warm but not hot," she explained. "I can feel when it's right." The clay dried slowly under the three suns. Sarah used the time to prepare her final workspace, arranging everything within easy reach. The quench would happen fast and hesitation could ruin everything. She tested her grip on the tongs, practiced the motion of lifting and plunging, ensured the oil trough was positioned perfectly. Finally, the clay was ready. Sarah lifted the coated blade with her tongs and carried it to the forge. She buried it deep in the brightest coals and began pumping the bellows with long, steady strokes. The temperature climbed rapidly. The monitoring equipment tracked every degree. 1500, 1600, 1700. The steel began to glow through the clay coating, a deep red that brightened to orange, then yellow, then nearly white. "Critical temperature approaching," a technician announced. "Crystalline structure is entering transformation phase." Sarah watched the blade with unwavering focus. The color was everything now. Too cool and the hardening would be incomplete. Too hot and the steel would burn, its structure destroyed. She needed the exact moment when the crystalline bonds were ready to transform. The blade glowed brilliant yellow-orange, the color of the midday sun. Sarah stared into that light, reading it like others might read a book. Her ancestors had taught her this, and their ancestors before them, knowledge passed down through countless generations. She knew this color. She knew what it meant. She pulled the blade from the forge in one smooth motion and carried it to the oil trough. For one suspended moment, the glowing steel hung above the dark liquid. Every scanner in the courtyard focused on that blade. Every eye watched. Sarah plunged it into the oil. The reaction was violent and immediate. The oil erupted in flames, sending a pillar of fire 3 feet into the air. Thick smoke billowed upward. The clay coating cracked and hissed as thermal shock ripped through it. The sound was like thunder, like breaking glass, like the world splitting apart. Inside that chaos, the steel underwent its final transformation. The monitoring equipment struggled to track what was happening through the fire and smoke, but fragments of data came through. The edge, cooling rapidly through its thin clay coating, formed a crystalline structure called martensite. Incredibly hard, sharp enough to cut nearly anything, but brittle if struck wrong. The spine, protected by thick clay, cooled much more slowly. Its structure remained more flexible, more resilient, able to bend and absorb impacts without shattering. Between these two extremes, a gradient formed. Not a sudden boundary but a gradual transition where hard blended into flexible across thousands of microscopic layers. The contradictory structures Tor'van had said could not coexist were joining seamlessly. The flames subsided. Sarah held the blade in the oil for several more seconds, counting silently, then lifted it clear. The clay coating was cracked and falling away. Beneath it, the steel had turned dark gray, almost black. Steam rose from its surface. She set it carefully on her anvil and began tapping away the remaining clay with gentle hammer strikes. Pieces fell away, revealing the blade underneath. It looked unremarkable at first, just dark metal. But when Sarah took it to a grinding wheel and began cleaning the surface, something extraordinary emerged. The Damascus pattern revealed itself slowly. Waves and swirls flowed along the blade like frozen water. Light and dark bands created designs that seemed to shift as the viewing angle changed. Some areas showed tight, dense patterns. Others showed broader, sweeping curves. No 2 inches were identical, yet the whole possessed a unified beauty. The Quorath audience gasped collectively. They had seen the pattern before on the blade Sarah brought to the exhibition. But watching it emerge from raw ore, from fire and hammer and clay, from techniques their ancestors had abandoned millennia ago, made it seem almost magical. Tor'van stood and descended from the viewing platform. He approached Sarah's workspace slowly, his expression unreadable. Other forge masters followed him. They formed a circle around the workbench where the blade lay. "May I test it?" Tor'van asked formally. Sarah nodded and stepped back. Tor'van produced a series of testing materials from a case his assistant carried. Standard blocks used to measure cutting ability, impact resistance, and flexibility. He began with the cutting test, drawing the blade across a composite material rated to resist their sharpest quantum-forged edges. The Damascus blade sliced through it like paper. He moved to the impact test, striking the spine against a calibrated anvil with measured force. The blade rang like a bell and showed no damage. He increased the force. Still nothing. At impact levels that would have shattered most steel, the Damascus blade simply absorbed the shock and bounced back. For the flexibility test, Tor'van held the blade at both ends and began bending it. It flexed smoothly, curving into an arc that would have snapped normal high-carbon steel. When he released the pressure, it sprang back to perfectly straight. "Run a full metallurgical analysis," Tor'van ordered quietly. Assistants brought scanning equipment and spent the next hour examining every aspect of the blade. Edge hardness comparable to their best quantum-forged combat alloys. Spine flexibility exceeding their most advanced flexible composites. Toughness that resisted fracture better than materials designed specifically for impact resistance. All of it in one piece of steel. Forged by hand. Created with techniques 10,000 Quorath years old. The senior forge master who had called for stopping the demonstration stood silently, staring at the readouts. Finally he spoke. "We have laboratories filled with quantum forges. We can manipulate matter at the atomic level. We can create bonds that should not exist in nature." He gestured at Sarah's simple tools, her stone forge, her clay and oil. "Yet we cannot make this. Our most advanced technology cannot replicate what she achieved with fire and hammer." Tor'van lifted the blade carefully and walked to where Sarah stood. He held it horizontally in both hands, offering it to her with a gesture of deep respect. "You have proven your claim," he said. "This steel was thought unmakeable. You made it. I apologize for my skepticism." Sarah accepted the blade and smiled. "No apology needed. Skepticism is healthy. But sometimes old knowledge holds truths that new technology hasn't discovered yet." She held up the blade so everyone could see the Damascus pattern rippling along its length. "We call this pattern the soul of the steel. Every blade is unique because every forging is unique. Your quantum forges make perfect copies. Beautiful. Precise. Identical." She turned the blade, watching light play across its surface. "But this can never be copied. This exists only once. That's not primitive technique. That's art meeting science. That's what your civilization lost when you chose perfection over personality." The courtyard was silent except for the wind. Tor'van stood with his hands clasped, his expression thoughtful. Around him, the greatest metallurgical minds of an advanced civilization contemplated the lesson a human had taught them with hammer and fire. The evening of the third day brought unexpected changes to the Quorath homeworld. Tor'van had ordered the demonstration to continue beyond Sarah's successful quench. He wanted comprehensive testing, complete documentation, analysis that would satisfy even the most skeptical members of his guild. The courtyard remained illuminated by artificial lights as scientists worked late into the night. Sarah sat on a stone bench near her forge, watching them examine her blade with instruments she barely understood. The Damascus steel passed every test they devised. They measured its molecular structure, its stress distribution, its performance under extreme conditions. Each new test revealed something their quantum forges could not replicate. Colrim approached her bench hesitantly, carrying 2 cups of a warm Quorath beverage similar to tea. He offered one to Sarah, who accepted it with a tired smile. "Thank you," she said, sipping the drink. It had an unusual flavor, slightly sweet with hints of something like cinnamon. "I have been reviewing historical records," Colrim said, settling onto the bench beside her. "My people abandoned hand forging 17,000 years ago. We believe technology made it obsolete. We were wrong." Sarah looked at the young Quorath with interest. "Technology isn't wrong. It's just different. Both approaches have value. But your approach created something ours cannot." Colrim gestured toward the blade being examined under bright scanning lights. "That troubles many of my teachers. They built their entire careers on the superiority of modern methods. And now they're questioning everything, Sarah nodded. I've seen it before. It's uncomfortable to realize you might have missed something important. They sat in silence for a moment, watching the scientists work. Finally, Colrim spoke again. Would you teach me? Not just the technique but the philosophy behind it. The way you read the metal, the way you judge by sight and sound instead of instruments. Sarah studied the young apprentice. She saw genuine curiosity in his amber eyes, not just academic interest but real desire to understand. It takes years to develop that sensitivity. Maybe decades. Are you willing to start as a complete beginner? Yes, Colrim said without hesitation. I want to understand what my people forgot. Before Sarah could respond, Tor'van approached them. The forge master looked exhausted, his ceremonial robes dusty from the long day. But his expression held something new. Not the skepticism Sarah had seen at the exhibition, but something approaching humility. The testing is complete, Tor'van announced. Your Damascus steel matches or exceeds our best alloys in every measurable category. More importantly, it does so through principles our current metallurgy cannot explain or reproduce. He sat down on the bench across from Sarah, his movements slow and deliberate. I have been a forge master for 347 of your Earth years. I have overseen the development of quantum forging techniques that revolutionized our industry. I believed we had achieved the pinnacle of metallurgical science. Tor'van looked at his hands, turning them over as if seeing them for the first time. Watching you work these past 3 days, I realized something. We gained precision and efficiency, but we lost intimacy with our materials. We program machines to manipulate atoms, but we no longer understand metal at the fundamental level you demonstrate. You want to learn? Sarah said. It was not a question. I want you to teach, Tor'van replied. Not just me but my guild. The traditional methods, the hand techniques, the knowledge your species preserved while ours moved toward pure technology. Sarah set down her cup and leaned back against the stone wall. That's a big request. Teaching one person is manageable. Teaching an entire guild would take years. And I have a life back on Earth, responsibilities. We would compensate you appropriately, Tor'van said. Name your terms. It's not about compensation, Sarah shook her head. It's about whether you're truly willing to start at the beginning. Because that's what learning this requires. You can't skip steps. You can't use your technology to accelerate the process. You have to build the calluses, make the mistakes, spend hours doing things that seem pointless until suddenly they're not. She stood and walked to her forge, running one scarred hand along its stone edge. Your quantum forges can create a blade in minutes. Learning to forge by hand means accepting that you'll spend months just learning to read the fire's color. Years learning to judge when the steel is ready. A lifetime mastering the subtleties. I understand, Tor'van said quietly. Or rather, I'm beginning to understand that I don't understand. That's why we need teaching. Other forge masters had been listening from nearby. Now several of them approached, forming a loose circle around Sarah's workspace. Some looked skeptical still, unwilling to fully accept what they had witnessed. Others showed curiosity similar to Colrim's. A few appeared troubled, as if their fundamental beliefs had been shaken. If we agree to learn your methods, one of the senior masters asked, what would you require from us? Sarah considered the question carefully. First, genuine commitment. This isn't a hobby or a curiosity. It's a discipline that demands respect and patience. Second, you start with the absolute basics. Hammer and anvil, fire and steel. No shortcuts, no technology assists. Third, you accept that failure is part of learning. You'll make terrible blades at first. Probably for a long time. She looked around at the assembled Quorath, these masters of an advanced civilization, and saw them genuinely listening. And fourth, you share what you learn. Don't keep it locked in your guild. Teach your apprentices. Spread the knowledge. These techniques survived on Earth because every generation passed them to the next. Tor'van stood and faced his fellow forge masters. She's asking us to become students again. To set aside our expertise and acknowledge that we have fundamental gaps in our understanding. To work with our hands in ways we haven't for thousands of years. He turned back to Sarah. I accept your terms. I will be your first student. Second student, Colrim interjected quickly. I already asked. A ripple of what sounded like laughter passed through the gathered Quorath. Then one by one, other forge masters stepped forward. Not all of them but enough. Enough to begin something new. Sarah felt a strange mixture of emotions. Pride that her craft was being recognized. Anxiety about the responsibility she was accepting. Hope that maybe, just maybe, she could help an entire civilization rediscover something precious they had lost. Tomorrow morning, she said, we start with the forge. Not this one. Each of you will build your own with your own hands from raw stone and clay. That's lesson 1. Understanding the tools before you use them. How long until we can attempt Damascus steel? Asked one of the younger masters. Sarah smiled. Years. Maybe never. Damascus is the culmination of everything else. You don't start there. You start with simple steel. Basic blades. Mistakes and failures and slowly, gradually, beginning to understand how the metal speaks to you. She picked up her finished blade, holding it so the pattern caught the artificial lights. This represents 15 generations of my family's knowledge. My great-great-grandmother taught my great-grandmother. My grandmother taught my mother. My mother taught me. Each generation added something, refined something, understood something deeper. Sarah handed the blade to Tor'van. I can start you on that path, but you have to walk it yourselves. There's no shortcut to mastery, no matter how advanced your civilization. Tor'van accepted the blade with reverence. When humans first made contact with galactic civilization, many species dismissed you as primitive. Yeah. Technologically backward. We thought we would teach you our advanced methods. He looked down at the Damascus steel in his hands, at the patterns that their quantum forges could not replicate. Instead, you're teaching us that we mistook advancement for wisdom. That we confused technological progress with understanding. That sometimes the old ways persist because they contain truths the new ways haven't discovered. The forge master raised the blade in a formal gesture of respect. Tomorrow we begin again. As students. As beginners. Thank you for this gift. Sarah nodded, accepting his gratitude. She looked around at the assembled Quorath, at their copper-toned skin gleaming in the artificial light, at their expressions mixing uncertainty with anticipation. She thought about the journey ahead, the challenges of teaching an alien species techniques developed by humans over millennia. But she also thought about the possibilities. What might emerge when ancient human craftsmanship met Quorath precision and patience? What new techniques might develop? What forgotten knowledge might other species have preserved? Kolrim approached her again, his amber eyes bright with eagerness. Tomorrow morning, then? We build forges. Tomorrow morning, Sarah confirmed. Bring work clothes and expect to get dirty. Forging isn't clean or comfortable. But it's real. It's honest. And if you give it the respect it deserves, it will teach you things no instrument can measure. As the Quorath began dispersing, talking excitedly among themselves about the days ahead, Sarah returned to her stone bench. She was tired, more exhausted than she had been in years. But it was good exhaustion, the kind that came from meaningful work. She looked up at the 3 suns setting in sequence, painting the sky in colors Earth never saw. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to share the knowledge her ancestors had preserved. Tomorrow, an advanced civilization would take its first stumbling steps back toward understanding metal the way humans still did. Tomorrow, the old ways and the new would begin learning from each other. And maybe, Sarah thought, maybe that was how real progress happened. Not by abandoning the past for the future, but by bringing them together, forging them into something stronger than either alone. Just like Damascus steel. Just like the blade that brought her here. Layers upon layers, different and contradictory, somehow working together to create something unmakeable. Something beautiful. Something real.